It's like my mouth knows I'm on the last one. It's like, bleh.
Welcome to Shat on TV Lovecraft Country, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the new HBO series, Lovecraft Country. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me is my co-host, Ash Lafley.
Hi, y'all.
And this is our deep dive edition where we look back at this week's episode of Lovecraft Country and provide our thoughts and analysis, plus the top listener email and voicemail for the week. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast and make sure you don't miss an episode. You can do that wherever you get your podcasts or by visiting shatontv.com/subscribe. And if you're a fan of our instant reaction live streams, we don't have those after this week. This is the finale of Lovecraft Country, but do join us at shatontv.com/Twitch, where you can see our upcoming schedule for watch parties and our Shappy Hour cocktail party, which is not happening this week, but will be back October 30th. Ash, this is it, the final episode of Lovecraft Country. We've got one more edition of the podcast that's coming up with final letters and thoughts and voicemail from people. But as far as our research goes, our job, this is it.
Yeah, it's been an interesting ride for sure. I think I feel the same thing I feel at the end of all TV series, which is I'm kind of tired, but it's nice to be reflective and think about the show as a whole. And I think we're going to have some good discussion because of that tonight.
What stood out to you about this episode?
So I think it's going to be a very divisive episode. I think that that's pretty clear just from the feedback we're getting. I think some people are going to like it as an odd episode to wrap up an anthology series that was super experimental. And so this kind of leaves people with some sort of closure to something that's very difficult to close. And I think there's going to be some other people that were not huge fans of it. As far as for me, I think at least there was a clean ending, which I appreciate. There wasn't like some massive cliffhanger that we were left with. The storyline that they were trying to tell, they did wrap up in a multitude of ways. And I have to say, again, in this episode, you notice that the acting is just, as always, super top notch. I mean, they did a fantastic job. Everybody from Christina to Ruby to Tick, everybody was, on their A game in this episode in terms of acting, which was a nice way to wrap up a season that's been kind of a masterclass in acting, regardless of storyline, regardless of script, just what good acting looks like.
And this episode's title was Full Circle, which I think really sums up what Misha Green and company were trying to do here. They really wanted to wrap up each storyline, and so they told us in the episode title. I mean, you have Letty and Tick's story, Tick and Montrose, Tick and Gia, Tick and Christina, Hippolyta and Diana, Ruby and Letty, the Black Shoggoth and the robot arm. Like, there are all sorts of things that we saw over 9 episodes, and here we really kind of brought them all back together. I think this can go two ways when you try to do this. Either you take this huge and ambitious sprawl of characters and they're in this massive web, and either it's going to be this gorgeous tapestry or you're going to get a tangled mess. I think we got the latter. I mean, it felt pretty messy to me, but there were glimmers of the former. There were moments and callbacks that really, really worked. They tried to do a whole lot, and most shows don't aspire to this much. And therefore, I think any shortcomings really had to do with just how sprawling they tried to make the story in just 10 episodes. A lot of shows, this would be the entire series, not just one season. And as we were talking to the audience, 2 big topics really came up that people want to know about. One was, how did all this magic work in episode 10? Like, what the hell was even going on? Where are all these characters going? What is the ritual all about? Why did Titus need a chunk of an old white dude? Like, what's going on here? So I think that's one thing we want to cover tonight. But the other thing was an interesting one. And normally we don't do like winners and losers or ratings or anything like that. But it was a question that came up from the audience that I think was a very fitting question to really show the nuanced and balanced perspective that you have to have when you're approaching Lovecraft Country. And that was how these storylines ended, right? In essence, with all these different characters, whether it's Diana or Hippolyta or Montrose, how do we feel their storylines went? The question was asked, and I think it's a good question. So we'll get to that as well. plus lots of voicemail and email to round things out for this episode. And then remember, we'll have one more episode next week just with voicemail and email. Of course, we'll address those questions, but really going to leave it to you, the audience. So if you'd like to call in, that's 914-719-SHAT, or email us at hosts@shatontv.com. So let's get to that magic we saw in episode 10. The first point of confusion for a lot of people was this ancestral space. So we see that the book opens up, Letty and Tick collapse, and they go to the ancestral space. And we see that for each of us, the ancestral space is different. So for Tick, he sees the Ardham Lodge. He's in that hallway with Hannah. That is his ancestral space.
See, and I kind of saw that a little different. I thought that the reason it was there is because of the person they were speaking to. So for Tick, when he's, talking to his ancestor, that's where she chooses to be, because she talks about how she was trapped there even in death, and that it took her a long time for her to understand that the flames were representative of her rage. So that is the place where she consciously chose to be. And then as far as Letty, she's there with Dee's mother. So Letty goes and she's visiting Tick's mother, Dora, that she's there in her childhood home. And for her, that space is defined by Dora's mother. So for me, the places where they're learning about this magic isn't necessarily a place that they're choosing to be, as much as it is whomever they're visiting, that's where they've chose to occupy, and what their ancestral space they've chosen for it to look like.
That's a great point, Ash. And in both of these spaces, we see this kind of infernal red, which to a lot of people appeared to be hell. And you're thinking, are these characters in hell? But then we get that explanation that it took a long time to understand the fire was my rage made manifest, and that it could be tamed. I realized this magic was not something to be feared, but a gift to pass on. And that ties so closely, Ash, with your explanation of that Sonia Sanchez poem from episode 9, Catch the Fire, where it's that idea that that rage and that fire is generally considered something to be destructive or consuming, when in fact it is also the power they have to carry on, right? As you said, the fire is what made the holes in the slave ships and let you breathe. That concept is strong here in episode 10. It's a beautiful tie to the previous episode. So in this moment, what we're to understand here is it's not just a field trip for Atticus and Letty. They're there to learn the magic that they can have, right? And they get this A-team game plan together. And I think a lot of people on first watch might have missed this. I certainly did. I didn't really understand what the plan was, so I had to go back and look at it. And what I gathered was, in these moments, getting the book of names, being introduced to these characters in this ancestral space, they learn that what they need to do is get a piece of Titus and a piece of a living Braithwaite. Now, as I was rewatching the episode, I was like, oh, well, living Braithwaite, that would be Tick, right? No, apparently they need to get it from Christina. And so that's why they needed Ruby to get Christina's blood. Now, getting the blood from Christina is no easy task, but the harder thing, obviously, is getting a chunk out of Titus, because dude's been dead for a very, very long time. So Tick and Letty, they hop in the old elevator, they drop down into the water. They're wearing their adventure gear. Something's going to happen. They make the a really beautiful circle to do the ritual, and they conjure up Titus in this ritual. And they do get that chunk out of him. I mean, Tick basically holds him down and cuts off a piece, but he escapes for a second. And again, I thought that was them casting a poor spell or something like that. But in fact, it's Titus fighting it, right? He's trying to get out to warn Christina. And so he gets out there and he drops the N-word, which I can't imagine having to be, the old white guy dropping the N-word on the set. That's got to be a terrible time. But he goes out there, he warns Christina in the middle of the street. Of course, she crashes her car into a light pole. And I'm curious as to how the fuck Ruby wasn't injured, but that's where we are at this point in the story.
Yeah, and I wish we'd found out a little bit more about like what they cut off. At first, I thought they were cutting out his heart, maybe. Because I figure blood magic, heart, maybe it's because we just watched Temple of Doom for Shat the movies. I don't know. But that's where I went, was I figured it was his heart, but it wasn't on rewatch. And I do wish, I think it's such a miss here. And if somebody, please write in if you know more about what this spell or ritual was supposed to be, like if it's based off of something in pop culture that we don't know about, because I thought it was really fascinating and an incredibly dramatic scene when they bring Titus back and then he disappears and then they bring all the ancestors back. I thought it was pretty cool and kind of reminiscent of the episode in the basement where they're using all of the, the ghosts, the spirits there that were so mistreated and tortured and abused by Hiram. I thought it was a great callback to that, but I just still don't really know why they were doing it or what they were doing or how it worked. And if you have an idea, please let us know, because I think it would be pretty neat.
So I think what they're trying to do is they got this plan from the ancestral space where they're going to make this spell that bans white people from ever doing magic again. And the things that they need is a piece of Titus Braithwaite and then the blood, or a piece of a living Braithwaite. Maybe what they cut off, maybe it was like a protection rune, like maybe he had something on his skin, but I didn't really see that. It just looked like a random piece of flesh. And I was watching it for the first time and I thought the same thing, that they were going for the heart. And I was like, well, that was really easy to get. And I was like, it's kind of flat and flimsy, but it looks like it's just a chunk of skin. And I think it might be maybe where a magical mark was or something like that, but it clearly was not shown anywhere on the screen. But Tick and Letty aren't the only ones trying to do a spell. The other thing we see going on, of course, is Christina trying to do her spell. And her magic is a little different, right? So while Tick and Letty are trying to use their ancestral magic to basically break this cycle or to turn the tables, Christina is just trying to do magic of her own kind, different from what her father and other members of the Order have done. And we're not really quite sure what she's trying to do except for gain immortality, but it's not really clear what the exact ritual is. But what was fascinating to me, Ash, is she shows up in the garage and she's talking to everybody. And the social commentary aspect of Lovecraft Country came back, where she says, this has never been personal. And referring to Tick, she says, his death is just a consequence of the spell I want to cast, right? I'm not killing him because I don't like him. I just got to do this spell. Holy shit, this is a powerful metaphor for racism today. People think they're not racist because they don't use the N-word. They think that's what being racist is, right? Or going out and beating up somebody because of the color of their skin. They think that's racism. But people won't accept that they're still benefiting from systemic racism, which is in itself a form of racism. Black deaths aren't personal. When you see somebody get killed by the cops, or when you see somebody put into poverty by policies, or see somebody redlined, you say, well, that's not personal. I have nothing personal against them. But it's a result of the kind of life you want to keep here in America, the neighborhoods you want to keep, the economy you want to grow, the dominant culture that you want to maintain, the names that you don't want to learn to pronounce. All of that stuff is essentially that type of racism. And it's what Christina's saying here. She's like, I don't have anything against Atticus. It's just for the things I want, he is an unfortunate consequence of that.
Yeah, and I actually hadn't thought about it this way until I was reading through your notes. And I think that that's actually both a brilliant observation on your part and a really fantastic thing for the show to be doing, because I think that one of the things that the show's been smart is to show the horror and the violence of such aggressive and systemic racism that exists through to today. But those microaggressions through the way that people are socialized and the way that people, even look at the election, the way that people are voting, where they vote so egocentrically versus voting thinking about, the whole of society, or the people who claim not to be racist and they say all lives matter instead of Black Lives Matter, and not understanding the distinction there, which, we got into really in depth on a Shappy Hour one week. I think that this is speaking to that type of racism. And for me, I think that's a lot more nefarious because of the fact that the big stuff, the people walking around in white hoods and burning crosses on lawns, they're pretty easy to ID, right? They got their tiki torches in Virginia and, in 2018, and then they, burning crosses here in Lovecraft Country. And so they're obvious. It's the ways that the people who believe they're allies that they also have this ingrained in them the way that Christina does, I think is a lot more insidious and a lot more difficult to stop and stemmy and to break.
And not to date this podcast, but Ash, I was watching those. I was watching the confirmation hearings and also the introduction of the nominee for the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett. And when she was presenting her kids, I think she got like 7 kids, right? She has her own biological kids, and then she has kids that she adopted. And her adopted kids are, Black kids. It was the way that she was referring to them. With the white kids, it was, it was about the hopes for their achievements, the silly things that they do. And for all of her Black kids, it was the sob story of where they came from, right? It was her land was ravaged by earthquakes, or she had a terrible sickness when she was a child. And that sort of consideration when it comes to people, that's the sort of racism that's present now. And those perceptions, they do take a toll. They have an impact on people, because those perceptions, when they are made pervasive throughout society, they limit your opportunities and they limit the way people see you. Now I'll get off my soapbox and bring up the big question that so many people had. What was going on with Letty? So we see Letty, she's fighting Christina in Ruby's body at the top of this tower. Letty goes over the side. I was convinced that she was dead. I was like, okay, like the show it's shocking us here. She hits the ground, but then they cut back to her like 3 times. I'm like, okay, she's clearly not dead. But people were wondering, like, how the hell was she protected? We saw her lose her invulnerability when Christina left the garage, and yet now she's okay.
Yeah, I tried to find an answer to this today, and most of the places that I get my reviews and recaps, they've all referred to this as mysterious, or the way that Letty mysteriously came back. I don't think anybody has any idea how this happened, and we'll put a call out again. If you have an idea, or if you have heard what the heck was going on there, please write in. Let us know. Calling all tinfoils.
Yeah, the tinfoil crowd needs to rise up right now and help us out. Now, here's what I've got. And guys, I hate tinfoil, but I really puzzled over this all night and day. And I came up with 3 possibilities. So one I mentioned on Lovecraft Live, which was there was a flaw in Christina's ritual. Now, we saw during the ritual at the Ardham Lodge that Sam Braithwaite had to relinquish his invulnerability momentarily in order to do the ritual. And that is when he was killed. And Christina orchestrated that, right? Well, I wonder here if in order to do this spell for immortality or whatever she was trying to do, she had to relinquish it for just a moment, and maybe it passed to the most recent person who had it, the last person who was given this invulnerability. I don't know. That's one idea. The other idea is that she has the Book of Names. She and Tick have the Book of Names. They went to the ancestral space. It is quite possible, since they've started speaking the language of Adam as well, that she was able to apply it to herself. Like she's got the Book of Names. It might have instructions for how to do this. We saw that the birthmark was in there. Maybe other symbols from the language of Adam were in there. And remember, Christina wants the Book of Names, so it's got to have some power to it. It's conceivable that she was able to do it to herself. And then finally, we see when Ji-Ah is channeling the darkness through her, there's all these like flashes that show us scenes that we've never seen before in the show. And in one of those, you see Ruby standing over Letty, and it looks like she's reciting some sort of incantation. Now, it could be Ruby, it could be Christina and Ruby's body. I don't know exactly what happened there because we never saw the scene. It was just a flash. But maybe Ruby did something. I just don't know that Ruby had the power to do it. So maybe it was like Letty said, hey, listen, I discovered this spell in the Book of Names. I need your help to help cast this on me. Although that seems like it would be somewhat out of character. Anyway, if you guys know, like Ash said, write in. And finally, at the end of all of this, we end up with the spell that Letty and Tick got working. So Hannah kind of foretold this, that what you're about to do with this spell is going to help everybody. In the end, white people get banned from magic. Letty says it point blank to Christina, it's not just you, it's all white people can't do magic. And I was left with a whole slew of questions after this. Like what is white? Because white's not a race. So I'm like, am I white? Can I not do magic? It was really a kind of a strange ending. And I get it from a symbolic standpoint. Yes, it makes a lot of sense. And then I was like, okay, it could be white as a cultural marker. So if you engage in the hallmarks of white culture, then you are banned from doing magic. But it seems like a strange one to me. And again, if you guys have ideas on what exactly that means, go ahead and write in host@shatontv.com or call 914-719-SHAT. And now is the time we warned you about, guys. It's time for our opinions on the show. Once again, you asked for it. We're just delivering what you asked for. And I think it's a fair balance. There were some characters I think that got a great treatment and other ones who didn't. And we'll start with the big guy himself, Atticus. This was a winning storyline for me. And it's not just because I love seeing the hero, die at the end. I think a lot of us felt from the beginning that Atticus would be a martyr in this tale. Something about the way they always presented him, the way he stood, the way other characters interacted with him, the visions that were had about him, the way that he mysteriously appeared in 1921. He was just sort of this character that always felt out of place. And Jia then reinforced that with her, with her vision in the Taiku episode. Then you had, that whole crucifixion illusion in the visions where he was, being hung up, and then we saw it again in this episode. A lot of this just seemed to signal that he's going to be a martyr. He's going to be the one that is sacrificed to save everyone else. I loved his storyline. I just wish I'd grown more attached to him because I felt guilty about not feeling more. I mean, I'm the type of person who will cry when a favorite character dies. I didn't feel that here. I just kind of felt nothing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I do love how the way they wrote his character, that he stayed true to the character that they wrote. There was nothing out of place for him. Every decision he made sense for the character that was being crafted. And that started with episode 1. And we got more in depth with, the episode in South Korea. And I thought all of that was great. And so he was a constant, and you needed those types of constants to ground a show that was presenting such disparate storytelling. I think that he was really important. And without him, it would have been just a total mess, right? Because he was your center that everything was kind of revolving around. And I liked that about him. And I think that Jonathan Majors did a great job playing him. But like you, I wish I'd grown to like him more. And I have to be honest, when he died, I was more obsessed with the idea of the CGI blood running from his arms and me trying to figure out how much was practical and CGI, because I just didn't really feel anything in that scene at all, because I think we knew it was coming and I didn't have enough of a connection to him to really feel anything when he died other than, okay, well, this was supposed to happen.
So the next storyline that people were asking about Ash was Diana. How'd you feel about her storyline and all this?
So I thought she was totally wasted, to be honest. I mean, she got that great episode with the Topsy and Bopsy chasing after her. I think that it was really nice to see a child's perspective of what this world was presenting. But in the end, I truly think the character was as abandoned by the writers as the character is on the show abandoned by the adults, right? They just kind of wrote her off and didn't really include her. And I know they gave her this ending scene. I'll be very honest, I didn't think the ending scene worked for her. I didn't think it was in tune with her character and who she was supposed to be. And I just think it's a bummer because the actress who played her was great and they needed this. They needed the child's perspective, which is an innocent perspective, to show just how terrifying the world was without the monsters and without the magic.
And Diana's this plucky, artistic kid. She's different in that way. And I think that's one of the problems that the show has overall is they didn't differentiate the characters enough. In the end, people's motivations generally were the same. In the end, people's behaviors were generally the same. And we didn't really get that variety of personalities in there. I mean, her story essentially is okay, I'm a kid. I like to do comic books. I'm pretty cool. I was I like this character. Then she gets cursed by a white police captain. She survives that. She gets a robot arm and then she kills the big bad. What's the story? How does she develop? I don't know who she is in the end of all of this. And I just felt like it was a disrespect to the character. Unlike, say, other characters like Atticus, where we really felt like we knew him in the end. And also everything that he did seemed consistent with his personality. And that brings us to Letty. I, along with most of the audience, I think wanted so much more for Letty. From the beginning, from the trailers, we thought that she was going to emerge as the shining star of the season, the chief badass, the woman who like realizes that her activism and her outgoingness and all the things that made her stand out and be chastised during her youth, that take no shit attitude, that's what was going to get her through. That's what was needed in a time like this. Huge times call for huge people. And then she shrank for Atticus, and then she just sort of just became a hanger on. And when she stabbed Christina through the back, I thought, oh, okay, we're getting like a sort of a Game of Thrones Arya Stark moment here. But even that we didn't get. What did she do in the final battle? They just kept cutting to her kind of babbling and staring at the sky. And I was like, why are you doing this to Letty? Like, we love Letty. What is this?
Yeah, I really enjoyed her character for the most part throughout the season, but I just think, again, a missed opportunity here. I think she, unfortunately, she was kind of portrayed as like this feminist character, right? Like this out of time feminist woman. And she wound up being pigeonholed by a love story with a dude and a baby. Like, and that sucks.
Yeah.
I think it really sucks. And I think it really goes against the feminism they were trying to do with her.
And I can feel the people getting to their keyboards right now or calling us up on the phone. It's okay. Like, if you disagree, totally write in. We need that for next week. Like, I want to hear about it, because like, salvage these characters, salvage these storylines for me. I welcome it. I think it'd be fucking really awesome if you could tell me, hey, Gene, here's what you missed about this. And I'd be like, great. You know, we still have one more episode to clean that all up. Now, Ash, that brings us to Hippolyta. She was a huge figure earlier in the season. How do you feel about her storyline overall?
I mean, I really enjoy Hippolyta as a character. I really enjoyed this character in the books. I think with her, it's not so much a missed opportunity as not enough exploration. I wish that we had gotten to know her more. She gets her singular episode, which I think is great. You know, the I Am episode is fine because it defines who she is, but I still was left going, but who is she, and why is she, and when is she? And the story just kind of becomes a bit of a jumbled mess, because you've got this very high level ambitious story you tell in her, you know, centric episode that's all about her, and then she just kind of falls back into the background. She doesn't become a primary player after that, and in the end I think we're just kind of left with her. We know she's a good mother, we know that she was a devoted wife, that she's loyal, we know that she's uber smart, but in the end, other than that, we're not left with a lot other than just a kind of a bad dye job, you know, that blue hair.
And in these final moments, I'm left wondering why none of these characters are doing anything. You know, you see Hippolyta, she's standing there during this ritual. She stands and it's like they forgot to write her, right? She stands, and then finally she's like, we better get out of here. That was it. I'm like, that's it? Like, you know, one of the strengths of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and everyone please hold your eye rolls out there, is that the battles that people fight throughout the movies, in their own individual movies, building up to these big Avengers movies, right? Those battles prepare them for bigger battles. And in each of those battles, they play their part. Yes, it's very formulaic. Yes, it's very predictable. But the thing is, it makes sense because you go, oh, the things that happened to Hippolyta, her experiences prepared her to contribute in some way to this climactic moment. And in this sense, she didn't need to be there at all. Hippolyta, Diana, they didn't have to be there at all. They could have stayed home and things would have turned out exactly the same.
Yeah, you would have thought she'd use more of like that gladiatorial like training she had too. Like, I guess I just expected more out of her.
Okay, and that brings us to Christina, and where I feel super guilty. I hate even saying this, in that Christina was probably my favorite storyline in Lovecraft Country. And it's not that I relate to Christina because we're both white or whatever. Her story was genuinely told the most completely. Like, we heard her whole history, what her motivations were. She had time to explain herself. She appeared in almost every episode, and she was the best communicator of the bunch. The speech that she gives in the garage in episode 10 is the most coherent and eloquent and interesting thing anybody had to say in this episode. of course, I love seeing the villain vanquished. So seeing her ended at the end of the season really, really worked for me. But it really sucks that that's the storyline I found most satisfying. Again, not because I related to it, but because it was the story that was told the best.
Yeah, she doesn't just get the most complete story, though, Jean. She gets the most complex story. Like, she's an incredibly complex character. I mean, because we get to know her not just through her, but through William as well. So we get to see all of these different portrayals and these different facets of her personality and her motivations and what makes her her. And I think that, I don't know, I just think that it sucks because this is a show that I think in so many ways is meant to like even the playing field in terms of the way characters are represented and the way that storylines are told. And it just sucks that in the end, hers is the only one that not just feels finished, but that felt satisfying. Like I walked away going, okay, that was a great arc. Whereas Tick, because he's the hero, I walked away going, okay, well, he was a well-written character sometimes. Not this was a great arc. She was the only one that I could legitimately say that about. And I think that's just a huge missed opportunity for the show.
One thing I will credit Lovecraft Country with is their decision to underwrite most of the other white characters. I found that very, very satisfying, right? Because if you've been watching TV for years, characters of color are consistently underwritten. You know, Thug 1, like they basically just act a certain way. And it was nice to see the cops were just one note characters. The neighbors were just one note characters. That was really great. But I wanted to talk about Gia for a second, because a lot of people wrote in saying Gia is going to make an appearance again. She's not just going to get the Daiku episode. She's going to come back and play a bigger role in here. Maybe the idea is that all the magics of the world compete with the magic of white people, or maybe that, you know, her abilities are going to make her uniquely critical to the storyline. And we got that sort of, but what about her? I mean, what about what she wants as a character? This is a terrible end for a character. She gets left by Tick in Korea. She tries to warn him anyway. She calls him and tries to warn. She finally shows up in America. He kicks her out of the house. Then they have a talk in a bar. And then basically, as was written to us during Lovecraft Live, she served as like a giant cosmic splitter. That was her job. And what's weird is that she also served to flash us these scenes when she was holding on to Tick and holding on to Christina, and the darkness was channeling through her. We saw these scenes, and those are scenes we really should have seen. I was like, oh, what's going on here? Like, what are all these things going on? There's the Black Shoggoths being like sort of tamed by Tick and Diana. It felt very Westworld season 3. I don't want to spoil anything, but the scene with Dolores when she gets hooked up to the machine. Yeah, that's what I felt here. And I was just like, what? No, like she deserves better.
Well, and just like Dolores in Westworld season 3, I felt fucking drained by the end of all of that because I think what a waste, because her episode, I thought that was such a fascinating, and I'm sure it's because I read the book and it was something that was so incredibly different than in the book that works so well. But, you know, that was such a great episode, and her character is so interesting, and the idea of the Kumeho and how she kills, I think is just fucking fascinating, right? And so you have all of that, and then you just get, you know, she's a conduit in life, and she's a conduit for the story in a way that just leaves her kind of on the sidelines. And, you know, I have here in my notes, I loved her episode. I hated her ending. And like, I don't know how any way to say it more succinctly than that.
And I don't want to bag on the crew who wrote Lovecraft Country, but I have to say that I've read several interviews now with the writers of Lovecraft Country. And one of the things that strikes me over and over again is in the interviews, there's almost an inability to articulate some of the decisions. When I read why they did things the way they did, there actually doesn't seem to be much thought behind it. It just seems like it would be interesting or it would be fun. And I think that Gia is an example of that. One of the heavier characters that they dealt with a little bit better is Montrose. Now, I'm overall satisfied with Montrose's story. In the finale, that ending, how he related to the rest of the events, I just don't know. A lot of people thought that Montrose was going to be the one who sacrificed himself, to protect his son, to protect his family. And the notion of Atticus dying to protect his family and give Montrose another shot at fatherhood is beautiful. He mentions that in his letter to his father, where he says, there's a child growing in Letty, and that's your chance to, kind of start over again. And that's somewhat satisfying. I was curious as to how people of color, and particularly gay people of color, felt about this character throughout the season. And Saeed Jones and other gay authors that I've checked in with on Twitter and in their articles have been outspoken on their disappointment in Lovecraft Country to responsibly handle queer characters. And so that's something I really want to go back and watch, in a rewatch of the season and go, were they fair? I know that there were a lot of objections raised to the way Yahima was treated, and I know there was an apology on the part of Misha Green for that. I felt like Montrose was handled fairly.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of my friends that are queer, I mean, they really took a ton of offense to this show and actually stopped watching. Two of them stopped watching after a while because they're like, this is just not for me. They thought it was very problematic. Let's just put it that way, the way that some of these characters are written, including Montrose. I'll say that I do think that aside, I think that he did have a nice arc. I mean, he had a wonderful journey on the show, which I think is great. I think it would have fixed that problem of me feeling something if Montrose had sacrificed himself for Tick, because I think that would have been a beautiful culmination of his redemption as both a person and a father. I think that would have been the one time maybe he ever was actually a dad to Tick, if he had sacrificed himself then. I also have an issue with this whole thing of Tick leaving behind a kid. I mean, I can't imagine leaving my children with my abuser. Even if I understood that abuser and understood that there are nuances that make people become abusers. Abusers are created, they're not born. And so I understand that and I sympathize with him. But I found that to be, I kind of prickled up, I guess, just as a parent. I went, really? Like, you're going to leave him behind with, how he raises kids. Like, and I think that that's a big thing you think about when you're a parent is who would you leave your kid to if you died? And I can guarantee you, I would never leave them to my own abuser to quote unquote give them another chance. Maybe I just don't have enough faith in humanity, but I didn't get that. But I do think that Montrose, I mean, gosh, man, that scene alone of him in the ballroom, at the drag show, I mean, that was such a beautiful scene. So I enjoyed his character much more than I did some of the others.
And to balance out our opinions, I should say that if Montrose were portrayed the way he appears in the book by Michael K. Williams, we'd be sitting here on the same podcast saying, what a waste of an acting talent, because he's barely described in the book, much less examined in this way. He's basically just a one-note malevolent character, and here we see so much more done with the character. So kudos to the show for doing that. I think what we're saying is Montrose's character was written with a lot of depth, but it may not have been the best portrayal for the gay community, and also it may not have been the best use of the character in the overall storyline. And that brings us finally to Ruby. Ruby, to me, is probably the most disappointing storyline in Lovecraft Country. She may or may not be dead. We're led to believe that Christina killed her and took on her form, but we also know that for this magic to work as it did with William, it needs to be a person sort of in a comatose state. So maybe she's out there somewhere still alive. But what bothered me, whether she's alive or dead, is she's the character with the most character. I mean, she is the one that springs to life on screen. She's beautiful. She's powerful. She's conflicted. She's interesting. And she was sidelined during the climax. And I just kept thinking she could have brought so much more to the final scenes. Also, her final moments on screen were so meh. Like, if you want to play something up for emotional appeal, if you want to put the audience through something, if you want us to feel something, show us Ruby's final moments. That's where you're going to have me. And then, of course, people also mentioned that they appropriated her black body and flippantly, it was just like Christina's like, oh, it's another thing I'm doing. And we didn't feel the anguish of that. We were not shown the pain and the horror of that when we spent so much time on the pain and the horror of her transformation in and out of a white body.
It's another queer character, right? That wasn't exactly written well, or at least wasn't giving a satisfying ending, because Ruby is a queer character. I mean, we see that because of the fact that she sticks with Christina when she finds out that Christina's a woman. I will say that I did read an interesting theory, talk about tinfoil here. And I don't know how much, we should buy into this, but people were talking about how perhaps Ruby still sided with Christina, and Christina took Letty's mark away. And so she took her invulnerability away. And Ruby reminded her that she was supposed to save her. And so she gave her the permission to use her body. Basically, she let her use her body, and she went, and that's why she says to her, she told me not to harm you. And then maybe she gives her the mark back and pushes her out the window just to get rid of her because she knows she'll be knocked out for however long, and then she comes back to life. That would make sense to me. But then also I think it's problematic with the idea of Ruby still siding with Christina, right? Like all of that I think is really complicated. And I think that's the problem here, is we don't quite leave with an understanding of where Ruby stands or where Ruby falls, because she is so sidelined by her sister, as she supposedly is on the show, right? Like in her history, she's sidelined by Christina, and she still doesn't have any sort of agency at all at the end of the series. And I think that that's a real bummer, because Wunmi Mosaku, she's a powerhouse. Like, I don't know if we saw any acting better than the acting she did, even in those quiet scenes where she's looking at Letty and is like, I can't believe you're still doing this, that you only want a family when you want something from me, right? Like, even just the delivering of those lines were so incredibly powerful. And it's not just a missed opportunity. It's just tragic, because she could have had like her own series. She was so interesting. Her character was so dynamic, and the storyline, love it until the end.
This to me is like if Game of Thrones just skipped the Red Wedding and just told you afterward, like, and those characters are gone now.
Right. Yeah. By the way, all the Starks are dead except for 3. Well, 4.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. Well, if you haven't watched The Red Wedding by this point, guys, so I'm not going to apologize for that. This isn't like Big D giving away the Nazi on Shat the Movies. Everybody knows what the fucking Red Wedding is by this point. Even people who don't watch, my dad doesn't watch Game of Thrones, and he made a Red Wedding reference a couple of months ago. And I was like, what? It's a cultural thing now. So.
All right. So what we'd like you guys to do is call in, write in either 914-719-SHAT or write in at host@shadontv.com. Let us know what you thought of these story arcs or any characters that we left out. If you were pleased, displeased. Again, these are strictly our opinions, and we'd love to hear yours as well and sort of balance these out. Or if you agree with us, that's cool too. Let us know. One other thing I wanted to cover before we get to the email and voicemail for this week is some of the music that was used in this episode. Now, we didn't get our classic voiceover like we normally do, but we did get some really cool musical allusions in this episode. And one of them was Keep Your Lamps Trimmed and Burning. So we hear this gospel tune being played when Tick is connected to the restraints during the ritual, and Letty shows up. She tells him that she loves him. It's a very powerful musical presentation. And Keep Your Lamps Trimmed and Burning alludes to the parable of the wise and foolish virgins. Now, this is in the Bible. In essence, the story here is that there's virgins, they're waiting on a bridegroom, and some of them have prepared themselves with enough wick and oil to keep their lamps, burning, while others had to, they ran out and they had to go to provision more. And it's basically an idea of being prepared for the second coming, right? And so I think it plays very nicely into that biblical allusion, but also is being done, of course, by a Black artist in 1959. So in this case, it is Mississippi Fred McDowell. If you've heard other versions of this, the Reverend Gary Davis did kind of a more upbeat one in 1956. And then my favorite version of it is the Blind Willie Johnson version of it, which was recorded in 1928, which has this beautiful like female accompaniment as well. I believe it was his wife. And Blind Willie Johnson had an amazing backstory as well, where he was like 6 or 7 years old. And the story goes that his dad was cheating. And so his stepmom like threw a lye mixture into his eyes and blinded him. Crazy. Other stories go that he just wore the wrong prescription glasses and went blind, or that he looked into the sun during a solar eclipse. Any way you slice it, Blind Willie Johnson, very, very fascinating. And his version is the best. This is an okay version, but really go check out the 1928 version.
Wow.
One other song featured in this episode was that Shaboom, Life Could Be a Dream. Now, if this sounds familiar, obviously we heard it at the beginning of Lovecraft Country 2 when Tick is in the bus. Here's where it's interesting, though, is the version that we heard at the beginning of Lovecraft Country was a cover version by the white Canadian group, the Crew Cuts, who took the #1 spot in the U.S. in 1954 for their song Shaboom, Life Can Be a Dream. But the version we see in episode 10 is the original version, which was written and recorded by the black doo-wop group The Chords. Guess what? Surprise, surprise. They did not hit the U.S. #1 in 1954, the same fucking year. Very poignant. And from what I've seen, the crew had a lot of fun doing this scene. This was actually the last thing that they filmed. And so I thought it felt very out of place and weird in this episode, but in fact, it was like almost like their celebration at the end of all of it. And when you put it that way, I almost wish that they'd put it at the end of the season, right? Maybe a flashback to their drive over there would have been really nice.
Yeah, I don't know. It's weird. I think that music always, like, you have these weird kind of connections to it, and the song will always be the song from not Clueless, sorry. It will always be the song from Clue. That, the movie Clue, they sing that song. It was the first time I'd ever heard that when I was a kid watching that. And every time I hear this, I think of Clue. So,
God, I love Clue. Big D doesn't get it, but I love Clue.
Which I don't get you, Big D.
And Ash, that brings us to the home stretch for this edition of the Lovecraft Country Deep Dive. We have a few voicemails and letters. Again, if you don't hear yours this week, check for them in next week's episode. We still have one more episode left. It will be a final all letters and voicemail episode. So we'll get to it there. And again, we'll be responding to your emails as well on the website as we get them posted. Big thanks to Big D for getting those posted on the website. And big thanks to Ash for responding to them. Our first voicemail comes from Chris in Minnesota.
Hey, Shat crew. This is your old pal, Chris from Minnesota, longtime listener, sometimes caller, and just kind of wanted to give my quick thought on the ending of Lovecraft Country. My wife and I have been following this pretty closely, and I have to say, overall, the final season finale, both of us were a little disappointed. And I think our biggest kind of issue with the ending season finale was just the execution, which just wasn't that tight and a little sloppy. If you take a look at Lovecraft Country as a show about the commentary of racism in the U.S. and struggles of minority groups, in this case specifically the African American group, I think there's a lot of ways that Lovecraft Country does succeed in the imagery and the story that they tell and the characters and struggles that they go through. But I think just as a TV show that is connecting one plot to another, that is trying to just basically tell a story, it's just pretty sloppy. Things like, how did Letty get her invulnerability back? Why did Diane suddenly become evil at the end and rip out a throat? Tick's monster. Oh, where was it the last 2 or 3 episodes? And I think the show makes a mad dash rush to kind of fill in a lot of these plot holes and gaps, but it just doesn't work. And it's disappointing because many of these characters I've really grown to appreciate and in some aspects love, and I do want to learn more about them. But I really wish that more attention on how we connect all these various plot devices, how we keep the story moving forward, was it just a little more cohesive and tighter. Anyways, just kind of wanted to give my quick 2 thoughts. I'm looking forward to season 2. I'm excited to see how they're going to take the fact that now magic is only limited to one particular ethnic group, which, I think is interesting that if we basically see a correction is heavy-handed in one direction, how that group is going to be dealing with that power. And I suspect that maybe that season 2 is going to be all about. And maybe the ramifications for doing such a heavy-handed course of action. Anyways, those are my thoughts. Again, Gene and Ash, you guys are doing a fantastic job. I really appreciate your commentary for this and the movies, and looking forward to more. Thanks.
I have to say thanks so much, Chris, because I think you really wrapped up beautifully for me, like my issues with the finale. You did it in a really succinct way in terms of both the potential, the good, and the potential, lost opportunities, let's call it that they had in this episode. And also, I just love how calm your voice is when you present it. Gene and I tend to get super fired up, right? That's part of podcasting. It's well, no, I wanted it to be like this. Well, no, I thought it was going to be like that. We get really fired up about it. And you were just very calm and cool and collected. So we appreciate you calling in. And I do agree with you, that mad dash rush that you said, that phrase right there. I think that's what this episode felt like. It felt like one of those shows that found out 3 episodes before the finale that they weren't going to have a second season. And then they had to push everything in. And we know that that isn't the case. I mean, Misha Green has been clear that she has an idea for season 2. It just hasn't been greenlit yet. So I do think that you wrapped it up. You kind of took lots of words and thoughts out of my mouth and head, and we appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris, for writing in. And clearly, Tick was keeping the Shoggoth in the cellar. That's what that red light was.
Duh.
All right. Our next voicemail comes up from Renita.
Hi, this is Renita. This is for Lovecraft Country. I was just finishing up listening to the Twitch. And one thing that was said was, why did Christina have to die? She was just she should be able to live out her life without having privilege, and she's just a skinny white woman, and what harm could she do without magic? And I think what also is missed here is that it was a white woman that accused Emmett Till and got him murdered. It was also another white woman who said something against a black man that caused the massacre in Tulsa. So even though magic is taken away, I think there's still the undercurrent that there is a lot of harm that can still be done by just being a skinny white woman in America, because there's a system that is behind you. We could say one word that someone did something, and whole generations and towns and people can be killed and disappeared off of the word of one person. So it's more than just magic being taken away. And that's why I think she had to be on out of here. Love your coverage of the show. Keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Renita, for writing that in. And that's part of the conversation, as you mentioned, that we had on Lovecraft Live on Sunday on Twitch. I think where the question is, though, is then it's well, where do you stop with the killing? Do you kill every white person? Because any of them can make that, accusation. I think that's part of it. And then another part of it is there was clearly a thought put to the fact that Letty and Montrose and Hippolyta and Gia all decided not to kill Christina. She was pinned right there. I mean, they could do it, but it had to be D. And so that's the question as to why it went that way. I think that's why people were a bit perplexed, right? Is if the intent was to leave her without magic and that was her punishment, then what the hell was the point of killing her? It's the two punishments conflicted. I think that's all people were saying. But I totally agree. A white woman is still potentially a death sentence for any person of color if they use the system to their advantage. All right. And now it's time for the email. Ash, take it away.
So our first one comes from RJ. I am a Black woman in my 30s. I was raised in Pennsylvania in a firmly middle-class neighborhood and steeped in Black culture from the door. I traveled the world in the Air Force but never experienced racism until I got back to the States, and it has only gotten worse since then. The only way I can describe this show is cathartic. Aside from visiting the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in D.C., this is truly one of the only times I felt validated. Black people are not crazy. That they're not overly sensitive, that white supremacy is real, and that people are fucking with us. I was hesitant listening at first because I was concerned about your viewership under the white gaze, but you actually do a really good job. Not to be mammy and rub salve on your wounds, but it sounds like you two got beat up a lot about reviewing this episode. Just wanted you to know I appreciate your views. You were able to put your finger on something that I wasn't able to articulate about a relationship I was in. I heard Hippolyta say, but you brought it home. I was shrinking myself for a man. If this was therapy, it would be a breakthrough. Thanks again, and I'll be listening for more. RJ. So, RJ, I've been to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and if anybody out there hasn't been, I would recommend if you're in DC to certainly go. It's a wonderful museum. Also, the lynching museum, the history of lynching and the horrors of that. That's another museum that I think is something that every person in this country, especially those of us that are white, should be forced to go walk through and experience, because I think those are, I like how you say that you felt validated here. I think that it's so important for you to feel validated. And I think it's also so important for people like me to feel convicted, right? And those things provide those opportunities for us. And I certainly think that this show did that as well. I'm so glad that it provided you validation. And it certainly provided me at times that type of conviction that people that look like me need to have. And we appreciate the kind words. We're glad that you've been with us. We're glad that you've been listening. And hey, we'll send you your therapy bill, because anytime we can provide you breakthroughs out there, we're more than happy to do it. All right, so our final email for the night, just for tonight, is from one of our good friends, Susan at State College. And she writes in, "Hello, Ash and Jean. Lovecraft Country accomplished some rather impressive world building in a comparatively short time. After the first couple episodes, I knew to be worried when the cops showed up. I knew the diner stop was a bad idea. I knew any helping hand had an ulterior motive. Horror stories don't get happy endings. They get survivors and sacrifice. And the sacrifice in Lovecraft Country had meaning. A way for Tick to finally protect his family from magic and Christina. Did the show go too far when Diana strangled Christina? At first, I thought the Shoggoth should have been the one to kill Christina. I realized that would have simply been death by proxy and still Diana's decision. By killing Christina herself, Diana made it clear that she was capable of protecting herself. And finally, should an old white woman express an opinion about this show? I think so. Well, I'm not who this show was made for, as so many people are wont to say. It is a show that was set up to launch conversations and questions. I believe it succeeded. I believe it might open the door to more stories told by BIPOC authors. And maybe one day, white viewers and readers won't need to scour Google to understand what the story is saying. That historical events won't need to be explained or exclaimed over, as in the first time anyone ever even heard of it. My random thoughts. Thank you again for doing this show. Stay safe. Stay well. Susan from State College.
You know, Susan, we've shared opinions, both positive and negative, about Lovecraft Country, but one thing I think everyone can agree on is you're changed after watching it. And maybe that's the point of the show, is that Ash and I are different after having seen it. It changes the way you view the world. Like you said beautifully, when cops show up, now you know that's bad. You know that going to the diner could be dangerous. You know that anybody who's trying to help you has an ulterior motive. And that's something, as a fairly protected, sheltered white audience, we might not recognize without seeing this show. Maybe the lessons learned together are the point of the show, is to change your worldview just slightly and make you more aware. And if it's doing that, it's a pretty effective education. Thanks for sticking with us all season, Susan. And that concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Lovecraft Country. We hope you enjoyed it, and you'll join us next week for our final episode covering your letters and voicemail. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcasts. The website is shatontv.com, or you can email us, hosts@shatontv.com. You can call us 914-719-SHAT, or join us on Twitch at shatontv.com/Twitch, where we're live on video. Not this week. There will be no Shappy Hour this Friday, but we'll be back next week with the Shappy Hour. And also on November 1st, 5:30 Eastern, we'll be doing a Hot Ones challenge where Steve W., who writes in, and I will be eating hot wings along with a lot of other listeners. That should be a lot of fun. We're going to possibly die. You can also check out our sister podcast, Shat the Movies, where we join our good friend Big D, Dick Ebert, to cover 80s and 90s movies commissioned by you, the listeners. You can find past and future episodes at shatthemovies.com. As Ash mentioned, right now, we have Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade out, and we will have a very special Halloween episode next week with Halloween 4. Wherever fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, please leave a review. That helps the podcast grow. On behalf of my co-hosts, Ash Schlafly, the King Bee, and Big D, Dick Ebert, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us next week for our wrap-up for Lovecraft Country.
It's over, y'all. Bye.